think the numbers seem to have stabilised, so we'll just make a start. I'll introduce myself. I'm Aileen Buchanan, in case you don't know, based at the Elgin Advisory Office, and I manage the North East discussion group. Tonight we've got our host farmer, Sam Parsons, who will be getting introduced later on. He's got the posh title of the Farms and Estate Director, actually, but we've just got him down as Farms Manager. And I'm also ably assisted tonight with technical support with Craig Bothwell, my colleague who's based down in the Edinburgh area. So welcome along tonight. This is our second year. We had a very successful farm visit last year. Virtual farm visit tour, so we're having another one again this year. The plans for this evening, it should run about an hour and a half. We're aiming to finish about 9 o'clock, although there's no fixed time. We've got 4 videos to show you this evening. An introduction video which will introduce Sam and the farms as well, and then a video about the mob grazing and his cattle, and then a bit about another video about the Bale Grazing, and the final video about his cropping. We'll probably stop for questions after videos 2, 3 and 4. We'll go straight on to the mob grazing after the introduction, and then hopefully we'll have a question and answer session at the end as well. I don't know, everybody's getting used to have meetings on virtual meetings now on Zoom. But if you want to, there's quite a lot of us on the meeting tonight, so we'll probably not use the raise hand function. But if you just put questions in the chat or question and answer box, we'll pick them up later and answer them as we go on along. So if Craig, I'll just maybe get Craig to do the introduction video, and then we'll get Sam to come in and introduce himself. And
hello, Sam Parsons. I manage the Balcaskie Estate in East Neuk of Fife for the Anstruther family. The estate is around 4,500 acres, and of that we farm just over 3,000 acres in hand. We've got a range of soil types from coastal right on the cliff up to about 650 feet above sea level LFA land, and up until 2016 we were a fairly conventional arable farm with some Suckler beef cows. And in 2016 we started conversion to organic farming, starting at the top of the farm, working down, and this is our final year of any conventional crops. After this harvest everything will be 100% organic. We are currently, because of the organic conversion, we are using grass as our fertility building break crop, and so we're somewhere in the region of 2,500 acres of grassland now, and we are probably about 700 acres, I think, of arable this year. That will drop slightly again for next year as we try and change the farming system, but I think we'll settle out around that split long term. We've got about 300 head of Suckler cows at the minute, and around about 800 ewes. Both of those numbers are increasing as we increase the area of grassland. We've got a small herd of pigs which we started last year just to supply the butchery, and they just make use of spent grains from the mill. Predominantly we were growing feed wheat for distilling. That was our when we were conventional, that was our main output. And organically, obviously, you can't grow as much in the way of cereals without putting the fertility back in. So we're becoming more of a livestock farm with a little bit of arable. And the arable we're growing now is milling wheat, milling oats, and probably some human consumption beans as well. And so that's really governed and limited by the amount of fertility we've built in the soil since 2016. So we're not quite at full capacity yet. The Anstruther family did a 50-year review. They looked back 50 years and predicted forward 50 years based on some simple metrics of, it didn't matter whether it was risk or financial reward or employment, but also biodiversity as well. And they realised that actually all these things had gone down in terms of, and if we didn't change the next 50 years, it was likely it wouldn't get any better. So they took a gamble that they felt that customers within the next 20 years would actively seek natural food as opposed to synthetic food, and they thought that the closest thing they could see was organic farming as the sort of set of rules that was easy for people like me to follow without having to try and make a decision on every single input or farming technique. So they set out in 2015, that was a vision, and in 2016 we started.
Thank you, Craig, for that first video. That gives quite a good introduction to the farms, and we've got some main farm facts there. One thing I should have said at the start, that the groups and this evening's meeting has been funded by the Farm Advisory Service under the SRDP Farm Advisory Service. Okay, I'll introduce maybe Sam Parsons if he wants to. I think he's just coming there. So without further ado, I'll just pass over to Sam.
Thanks so much, Aileen. Well, thank you for joining us. And I realised I've actually worn the same shirt as well, which is even better for continuity. Welcome to Balcaskie, and I think you've seen from the video that the sort of challenges that we've really faced is change more than anything. We're very used to agriculture making some small alterations over a long period of time to improve, but it's very difficult to make big sea changes in the way that we farm. And it's certainly been a bumpy journey, but I think we have actually enjoyed the conversion over time. And I think the output, and certainly financially, we're far better off than we were before. Our system has changed, and as you can see, we're farming a reasonable area of land, but we're fairly understocked at the minute, and that's been a big challenge. We've changed the breed as well. So not only changed from conventional farming to organic, but also tried to change the breed of cattle we had, which is easier said than done. And trying to find markets that will pay a premium for the products that we're growing. And all the time along the way, we're trying to cut costs out, because the one thing that we know is that our profitability is affected directly by how much we spend on inputs. Not being able to grow enough straw anymore makes straw an input. So that's why we trialed our winter outwintering cattle. And certainly from doing that, we're really cutting some significant costs out of the business, which is showing on the bottom line. And beyond that, we're trying to get used to growing smaller quantities of higher value crops, which is, again, a challenge, because we've spent the last, 50 years getting scale into an industry to try and cut costs. So we've ended up with large scale equipment and sheds and drying capacity, and we're now descaling that, which is actually much more challenging than I thought it would be. But ultimately, we're faced at the same time, we're trying to reduce our energy inputs. And so this is a good time for a rethink.
Right, I think we'll just go on to video 2 now, which is on just about the mob grazing and the cattle.
The reason behind the mob grazing system here was really essentially driven by the fact we couldn't grow enough straw anymore to keep our cattle inside for 7 months of the year. So we're looking at systems which enable us to extend our grazing season. And the way to do that was to store grass up, but also to make sure that the grass had deeper roots to allow water to infiltrate soils. And in making those changes, we also realised that our standard ryegrass clover mixes weren't very good at that. They're quite shallow rooting. And we've got loads of grass in July, but then we didn't have any in sort of October, November, and we just needed to spread the shoulders of the season out. So we started planting these herbal grass leys, which are mixed up for us. We've trialled all sorts of different mixes. We probably haven't arrived at the conclusion yet. What we've realised are there are lots of different species that you buy that will never grow. So we've tried to take them back out of the mix again and concentrate on things that we know work. And each one of these is designed to have a deep root and the ability to bring up minerals from deeper in the soil and to allow water to infiltrate lower down. Because we're grazing long grass like this, the cows are only in each paddock for 24 hours, So you can put them in on a huge amount of grass in a small paddock and move them on again, and you're probably only ever going to graze half of the grass that's there. It sounds like a lot of wastage, but actually that's protecting the soil because it's still a blanket cover. In the hot, dry weather in the summer, you don't get the same evaporation. In the winter, you've still got a mat for cows to walk on. And the grass regrowth is much greater because it's got this protection. So the volume of grass we can grow is much higher than we had previously and higher than we had anticipated. And our stocking densities as a result should have gone up, but because of our increased acreage under grass have actually shrunk. We're now swimming in grass and we need more stock. So we've got a lambing flock here, which we're increasing the number of every year to try and take into account this sort of, our grass growth is suddenly spiking because of the amount that we're planting. And sheep are a really quick and easy way to build those numbers and then shrink them if we need to, and we can manage them better with that. And our sheep realistically are making use of the first year of grass leys. We graze cereals with the sheep as well to act as a growth regulator. And at this time of year, the ewes will now follow the cows. So they'll just pick out, they literally, if cows have finished a field in a week, the sheep will move in, and we try and keep sheep paddocks rather than fencing for them. We just keep them in whole field, but they move every week. And I think it was an old saying that sheep should never hear the church bells tolled twice. Yeah, I don't know whether it's true or not, but we're trying to follow it. So this field of grass was sown this time last year after winter barley. We just disked the field and then sown it with a pico weed harrow, with a seed box on it. So it's broadcast effectively, rolled in left. The herbal leys are very different. Clover ryegrass, you'll be grazing it before Christmas normally. So on our conventional system, you'll be grazing them. With these, they're much slower to establish, and it's a bit disappointing the first time you see that. They don't really get going till May the following year, but when they get going, they really get going properly, and we can graze them with cattle first now. So these fields, we still graze them with sheep at lambing time because it's clean grass, and actually it doesn't do them any harm to tiller out, but their main productivity doesn't start till later. And this field of grass like this is probably going to stay down for 7 years or so, and then we'll harvest cereals from that built fertility. Theoretically, we've got about 7 years of grass, and then we'll take it out for a crop of milling wheat, and then probably either beans or milling oats, and then back into oats and then grass again. We're dabbling with barley again, but reasonably speaking, we're trying to get 3 crops between grass to try and maximise the income, cash income. Breeding wise, we are running predominantly Lincoln Red, pedigree Lincoln Reds now. We were simmling cows put to continental bulls, Simmentals and limousines, but they didn't finish well on grass and needed cereals. We had to be realistic about the cost of growing organic cereals, and it was too expensive to feed. At the same time, there's a lot of noise being made about the environmental impact of livestock, and grass-fed livestock tend to get a much better press, so we started to look at the Pasture for Life accreditation. So we're now fully accredited Pasture for Life, don't feed any cereals, and that needs a lot of native blood in the breeding. And so these Lincoln Reds, they're born and raised on grass. That's all they've ever seen. They can convert grass very effectively into quality beef. And that was another part of the sort of move, was to try and raise our game in quality terms and reputation. And we opened a butchery last year and started selling direct and wholesale. And it's been interesting to do that with our own beef and try and build those customers based on not only the way we produce, but also the way we butcher, which is very traditional, hung for a long time, dry cured meat. So the breeding was important because we needed something that was light, so it could stay out all year, finished off grass, and it was hardy. It could stay out. It didn't need to be housed, and so we've gone for the Lincoln Reds, which seem to be working well.
Well, we've seen about the video too. So just if there's any questions, you can just put them in the chat. But while we're waiting for questions to come in, I could maybe ask Sam a question. We saw there an autumn reseed, Sam. do you always do autumn reseeds, or have you thought of spring, or because you then talked about rotation of going into spring oats or kind of?
Yeah, we were predominantly autumn reseeds because our organic conversion was taking over after winter barley. We were using that as the entry. So it was a decent opportunity to put in an autumn reseed. But as we run out of winter barley now, because we no longer have conventional winter barley to follow, we are going to be spring sown. In the past, we'd avoided it because we found that we had a greater weed burden, but actually we're planting 17 different species of weed. So it really isn't that important. We can soon graze them out, but we will be switching to spring in 2022. We'll start all of that then.
Right, there's a question come in, a first question. Folk have been seeing they called it a gizmo in the field. So if you could maybe explain what that was.
Well, I'm assuming that's the blue gizmo that looks like a sort of hangman's platform. It is actually a cow scratcher, and it really started. It started for the simple reason that we had problems in some of the parklands with flies on cattle, where they're surrounded by trees, not enough wind, and the cows are being bothered. And unlike a normal system where they just keep moving around the field, we're fencing them into one part. And I felt that wasn't really very fair on an animal that couldn't get away from the flies. But I didn't want to start spending money on garlic licks, and we can't use spot on or whatever to get rid of flies. And these things have a pump in them, and we can use all sorts of natural remedies, which is sort of garlic oil and that kind of thing. And they work really well. But actually, the real value of it is that the cattle love scratching. And we surround them with about 9,000 volts of electric fencing for most of the time. And then when they get a break and they get towards a gate and there's no electric fence across the gate, they'd wreck the gate. They just want to scratch all the time. And so we'd actually tow that round with a salt lick tire behind it, and they get free access to rock salt. But the design of that is that there's a little sail on it, and the calves go and play with a sail with their heads, and it's soaked in the garlic oil or whatever. And then when they go and drink from the cow, they're actually putting the garlic oil by the udder. So it's worked really well, and it was a bit of a gamble. But we've now got 4 of them.
Well, they sound a good idea. And the next question is just asking whether you're autumn or spring calving.
We're now all spring calving. We stopped autumn calving in 2019 because they needed more space. We struggled really to keep them out and do a good job of them outside. I felt they also provided too convenient an option for slipping a cow through into the autumn herd and then back into the spring. And I think our efficiency was actually affected by it. So we're now all spring calving.
Right. We've got another question here that's asking about your Hi Sam. What's your overall stocking rate, cow and calf unit per hectare of grass?
I knew somebody was going to ask me that, and I had thought of working that out before I started. Put it this way, you won't be impressed by it. We're around 1,000 hectares of grass at the minute. We've only managed to get up to, 300 Suckler cows. There's about 70 heifers. We've only got about 250 yearlings, and then calves at foot. And then we've got at the minute, we've got 1,200 odd ewes on the ground, but we're just about sold out of lambs. So when you work it out, we are probably only about 0.7 of a livestock unit a hectare. It's really quite poor. We know that. The other thing is a lot of the grass is very new. We put, in 2020, we planted 700 acres of grassland, and we planted another 300 acres this year. So arguably the 400 hectares of the 1,000 has gone in the last 2 seasons. So it's really not mature grass either. But we think we'll probably top out, I would think, with our area, with around 450 Suckler cows, around between 1,250 and 1,500 ewes, and finishing all young stock.
That's good, because I think you said it takes a while to get the cow numbers up and changing breed and stuff as well, so it'll take a time to get up to the optimum level. We've got one here as well about which Hairbridge species you have found to be the most reliable for establishment.
I'd be lying if I said I had an answer to that, because I think every year I think we've got the answer. We find that the season prefers one or the other. But you'll see probably from some of the images there, chicory is definitely a good species to have in. I didn't like it when we started. I felt it was just tall and woody, and when we were growing it and set stocking, it really was pretty awful. And you could also see it was being grazed out year on year. But by doing what we're doing, it's actually remaining fairly static. We grow a lot. The mix when we plant it has a high proportion of vetch in it. And without wanting to divulge too many secrets in it, vetch is quite a heavy seed. And you need at least 50% organic by weight in the mix. And if you put vetches in organically, they're relatively cheap. If you put some of the other small herbal species in with it, it makes it a very expensive mix. The vetches get grazed out after the first year, but I'm not too bothered because they're cheap, and they just make the rest of the mix balance economically.
Good. And then we've got another one about, have you measured water infiltration in your soils?
Yeah, we have. We actually started doing that in 2016. We ended up using a soil mentor system. It was all sorts of, well, there were 4 main tests. One was water infiltration. One was a slake test that tells you how well bound the soil is together. One was earthworms, and one was, I can't remember, I think it was a VES, a visual assessment of the soil. I found that the only one that I really rated highly was the water infiltration one. And if you do them on the same day across different paddocks, it's a really quick way of knowing whether your routing is working. And we know that where we've grown herbal leys, our soil water infiltration speed is at least double what it would be in a ryegrass clover mix. And for us, that's the difference between grazing over winter and extending the season. And also in a dry season, those roots are down drinking water when grass would burn up otherwise. We planted our first herbal ley in 2015, and I really wasn't a big fan of it when we started. I didn't think it had the productivity. I didn't think it had improved lamb fecal egg worm counts. I thought it was okay, but it was costing quite a lot more than a standard clover ryegrass mix. But it wasn't until the later years when you really start to see it pay off. So if anybody does try it, just hang in there for a few years before you make the decision.
Good. We've also got one about what the available labour on the farms.
I think that's the same for everybody. I think the limiting factor for any business now is people. It's not, access to capital is always going to be a limiting factor, but actually there's a way around it with cheap borrowing. But access to good people and in a system change like this means that we are taking a fairly small pool of people and then we're halving it again. How many young lads want to come out on a quad bike and move cattle in November and December and January? Not many. We've actually started to recruit from outside agriculture to help with that. But of course, you still need those core skills. So we've got to have people within who know, one end of a cow from the other. It's been a real challenge, and we've had quite a turnover while we worked out what it was we needed. And it's been a rough ride. But once they're engaged in it, they become much more engaged in what they're trying to achieve and take more responsibility. So I think actually in hindsight, it's been well worth it, but it's been pretty hard work.
Good. Labour is always a difficult question. We're going back to more technical matters again. One to say, have you seen an increase in the soil organic matter yet?
Yes, we have. We tested it in 2015 before we started organic conversion. We tested it again last year. So we had a 5-year gap and a window. We have seen them improve. We've also seen them deteriorate. On the whole, they've improved, and we can't work out why the ones that have deteriorated have done. We are now looking for different ways of measuring. We were using loss on ignition for the soil organic matter test. Apparently that's quite a blunt instrument. I think really the proof is in the pudding, and we can get pretty good accurate results with laboratory tests, but they're very expensive. But take a spade and have a look, and it really does tell you everything when you start digging in the top few inches and start seeing what's happening on the top. So yes, it's improving. There are fields that I'm disappointed it hasn't improved faster, and there are fields that are sort of outliers that you can't work out why they've improved. So I think within the industry, we're still early days working out soil organic matter accurately.
Still getting there. This is back to the mix again. We talked about the herbs and stuff in the mix and the herbal leys, but this one's asking about the grass species that you include in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, ryegrass is very productive. It's a great feed. We did a trial with Watson Seeds, planting a field with strips in it, and the strips ran north-south, and then we grazed it with paddocks effectively east-west. The reason I wanted to trial it, I wanted to see what came back fastest, what was the preferred mix. What I realised was fantastic crop of ryegrass, not a single animal on it, and then some really pretty poor cocksfoots and species that we probably would have wanted to get rid of a few years ago, where all the stock were. That was their preferred choice, and it sort of taught us that realistically, if you feed a cow ryegrass and ryegrass only, it's like living on pasta. You'd soon get fed up with it. And so diversity is what we want. Ryegrass is very shallow rooted. It gives us a huge amount of bulk in July when we don't need it, but it doesn't give us anything at the start and the end of the year. And cocksfoot starts growing early. It's got deep roots. It doesn't look very palatable, but for some reason cattle like it. So we're using Timothy, which actually seems to do very well under this system, because when it heads, the cattle tramp it in, the seeds then redistribute either through the dung or by being trampled in, and it fills in any bare patches. And so it's like giving your field a reseed every year, more or less. So Timothy does well. But we still do put a bit of ryegrass in as well, because it gives us that earlier bite in the first year.
Good. I think then there's other two that I think we'll come back to when we've watched the next video. They're talking about how the cattle cope with inclement weather with minimal shelter. And then also about later on as well, we'll maybe at the cropping video about whether you're growing any legumes, grains, etc. for human consumption. So we'll get on to those later, but I'll just get Craig maybe to show the next video.
We started Bale Grazing a couple of years ago. I went down to go and see this system work in Herefordshire as a way of trying to extend our grazing season. So once we've got to January, the chance of there being enough grass still available in fields until we get our soils and our grasses up to their potential, it was going to take us a while. This was a way of speeding it up. Normally we would take hay and we'd lay out the hay bales at this time of year so we don't have to handle them again. And just leave the field shut up, don't touch it again until we're ready in January. And then we bring the cows in, they still move every day, and we actually unroll the bales because you get much more even grazing or eating of the bale. It doesn't leave sort of rings where the cows all stood round it, and so the recovery of the grass behind it is much faster. And we've done this will be our third year or fourth year of doing this, and actually the grass recovers really quickly in the spring. You can graze it again straight away. Annoyingly, we had to go for silage or haylage because we got caught out with making hay, but obviously we've now got to pay for the plastic to get rid of the plastic as well, so that's up the costs. Paid to wrap it, now we're paying to get rid of it. So we're trying to aim for hay. And the theory was, and the system I saw was taking hay from diverse grass mixes and unrolling it into fields of sort of less diversity and increasing the amount of diversity within our grass swards. And it has worked, but this is a field of red clover ryegrass, which is no longer the sort of grass we want to grow. So we are going to graze this to destruction effectively this winter, and then plough it out and put milling wheat in behind it. And effectively the bales and the cows out here are effectively a dunging and obviously the fertility is coming from the red clover. One of the reasons that the red clover ryegrass mix isn't suiting us very well is that we were growing this as a sort of high protein silage mix, and it's high volume, high protein. It's, I mean, it's rocket fuel. We were growing brilliant silage from it, but it's mining the fertility. And we've come back again 5 years after we did the original soil tests, and we're realizing that we're depleting the indices because we're taking large crops off the same fields, and although we're putting dung back on, we're not replacing enough. And we almost can't put enough dung on to replace the grass and then still silage it, because the dung is still there when we come to silage it, which obviously pollutes the silage. So we've gone for an earlier cut of silage now at the beginning of June, over a larger area but a smaller quantity, which is sort of counterintuitive in the cost, because obviously your costs when you contract it in are per acre. But actually we're taking a smaller amount of fertility off that. We're getting a higher quality grass. We're taking it earlier, which means regrowth is quicker. And it's sort of spreading our bets, and we're aiming to graze 1 year, silage the next, so we never take the same, take silage from the same field twice. And we know that where we've done this in the past, the Suckler cows actually have gained condition in the winter time. So where we're bale grazing on far worse grass than this, we're actually having to up the number of stock out in each group to try and stop them from gaining condition over winter. But I'm going to try our yearlings in here, so they'll be, hopefully they'll have finished their grazing cycle by maybe end of December. And rather than force them to do it again or force them around making a mess when the ground's wet, we'll just bring them in here. And I'm going to try and, these will effectively be fattening cattle. And we'll see how we get on. And if it doesn't work, well, it hasn't cost us a lot. And ultimately, we're not in a race then to get rid of them and sell them before they're 30 months. We'll still finish them because they'll finish the following summer. In an ideal world, we would have put these bales out after we'd finished grazing it again, but rather than double handle bales, we laid them out straight after we'd cut the silage. And the field's been set out to give us, I think this field's set out for 64 days for 100 cows, but actually we've switched that round and we're going to put 220 young stock in here and hope it lasts about the same period of time. If it doesn't work, it's just the end date that they come in at. It doesn't really make any difference to us. But the idea is that when we lay out the bales, we lay them out to give us all of January and all of February with cows outside, and they literally come in the day they start calving, walk into the sheds, and then start going straight back out again. So it's sort of planned around, we'll probably set stock our cows over the Christmas holidays to give everybody a break from shifting fences. So they'll go onto stubbles or onto the deferred grazing on a hill just for a few weeks. And then they'll come down and they'll start this at the beginning of January. That will give us right the way up to the 1st of March.
Well, Sam, I think I'll probably start with the question from the last time about how do the cattle cope with inclement weather with minimum shelter, because that's still not a lot of shelter that they're getting. So.
Yeah, none, basically. The sort of low point for me was last January, I think, when before it got frozen, when we had cows that we turned out onto bale grazing. And after 2 weeks, I was seriously doubting whether this was right for cattle at all. They were looking miserable daily. The ground was looking awful. I was feeling pretty gritty about it. And I thought, I'm just going to give it 1 more week, and if it doesn't work, we'll bring them in. And it dried up, and obviously I felt a bit better about it. And actually realised that the cattle were still at this point gaining condition. And a cow outside can cope with seriously inclement weather without coming to any harm whatsoever. The issue really is the ground, and if they're being moved every day, and in a really bad period of weather we'll move them twice a day, the ground doesn't suffer either. So the cattle were healthy outside. We didn't have any problems with them outside. Because they're outside, they're moving. We have in the past had a lot less interference for calving. They've been healthier. They've been able to calve on their own. We definitely find fewer problems when they're outside. The minute we brought them in to calve, they all got lice, and they just looked pretty scabby and awful. We wondered why we brought them in at all.
Right, I'll maybe just go back there because there's a question come in here as well that's maybe, well, it's for the first two videos, just while other questions are coming in. How do you keep on top of docks? This perennial weed problem.
You learn to love them. I think that's what I was told. Actually, I don't know whether it's in my head or whether it's reality. What we're finding is that a dock is an early adopter of bare ground. So if you've got bare ground, you'll get docks. If you can fill that bare space with grass and grass seed, over time it will disappear. We had a field that we had grown cereals in. It had been ploughed out of permanent pasture. I don't think it had been ploughed for 50 or 60 years before. We put cereals in, we undersowed the cereals. It was a really good crop of barley, but a terrible crop of grass, which meant that it was very bare. The docks that came through were phenomenal. And I took the decision to do nothing about it and just see if we could mob graze the field and use that to reseed the ground and thicken it up. And that was 2020 was when it was really bad. 2021, we mob grazed it. This year, we're probably, we mob grazed it. It was 2019, it was really bad. 2020, we mob grazed it. We did the same again in 2021. And I reckon we're down to about a third of the number of docks. And I am reasonably confident that we can get on top of it by the way we graze rather than having to try and manually weed them. Yeah, I'm not going to go in and top them, because if we do that, we knacker the grass as well.
Right, glad to hear that you're getting on top of it somehow. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll maybe ask as well. I picked up on that video that you said until your soil and grass reach their potential. Do you think you'll ever be able to do it without the bales, or do you think you'll keep on doing the bales?
There are a lot of people out there who say they can. I don't mind doing the bales, they're a cost, but I quite like the idea of having a very high density of livestock on a field that I'm about to take out and put in a cereal. So it's another tool, but the purist in the system would say that it's all cost you don't need. You should be able to do it with grass alone. I like the fact that with putting bales out, you can rectify, if you've got snow on the ground or you've got, really, really poor conditions, you can do something about it. If you've only got grass to go out, you need a serious number of acres to go out over the winter.
Interesting. And I also have just a comment going back to the docks again. David Juni has just said what you're doing should suit the docks. Alternating between grazing and silage from year to year, which you're doing, should minimise dock invasion. So,
it does. Certainly, you top a dock, you take the steam out of it. I know that where we're topping grass or we're taking silage, the vigor of that grass is, in comparison to where we're mob grazing only, is severely affected. So what I'd really like to do is cut down the amount of forage we cut, because that's definitely limiting what we do. But yeah, I mean, certainly if we alternate, then we should keep fields clean or cleaner.
Right, I'll maybe ask another question as well. Do you find that you've got enough? You're saying you're just coming in for calving and going back out again. Have they got enough grass? Do you manage to get grass early enough to get them back out?
Yeah, we actually save it over. So I know it sounds a bit ridiculous, but we won't tidy up every field of grass in the autumn or in the winter. We'll leave fields back for an early turnout. So we'll have cattle back out again in March.
Right. And a question here, do you have a topper?
Yes.
And how is outwintering affected to your hay consumption?
Well, we didn't used to make hay, so massively. We only started making hay when we started outwintering, and I like the idea of using hay. I was confident that we could make hay in 3 days organically, because it's a much lighter crop and there's no nitrogen in it, and it was fantastic. And I solved all the problems with making hay. And then we got caught out, and I learned my lesson. I think I just needed to have more confidence and leave it in the field rather than bale it. But actually, we're now making more hay. I don't mind if we make 1,000 bales a year of hay. We can grow loads of grass, but what I can't do is grow loads of straw.
Right. And I think you covered this, but it's maybe we're needing maybe to go over it. Do you use a ring feeder? I think you said you rolled out the bales. So
yeah, I know people who use ring feeders, and where we've left bales whole because they were frozen or because I was too lazy to unroll them or whatever it was, the damage done to the ground around and the recovery of grass is very, very slow. So what we tend to do is open the bale up, and then just we've made these tongs that go onto the hitch of the bike and on a chain, and you just kick them into the bale and just drive along the field and it unrolls the bale. That definitely works better.
interesting. And then we've got a comment from somebody saying the system seems ideal for improving soils within a mixed grass and arable system. And then they're asking, do you think it has wider application on a pasture forage only farms?
Yeah, I mean, if I was going to do this in my own, on my own now, I would, I certainly would never invest money in the shed anymore. I would just make my stocking suit. If you look at what the stocking density is on a lot of farms, you've got to work out what that stocking density is across all of your land, including the cereals that feed them or bed them or the hay or the silage. And actually, it's all diesel and it's all machinery. And you could do an awful lot with a bike and an electric fence reel.
I think this is maybe a good opportunity. I think maybe some folk might not be aware fully of what the pasture for life system or kind of is. If you can maybe explain a wee bit more about the pasture for life. Yeah,
it really started when we actually had to buy in barley one year at £300 a tonne, organic barley to finish cattle. And that's pretty painful for anybody having to buy in feed at that kind of money. And we split the shed in half and we fed half the shed on grass silage alone and half the shed on what they would normally have in grass silage, beans, barley. And we had about 60 days difference in fattening date, rather than, the weights are the same, the grades are the same, but the date was about 60 days longer. And it just didn't stack up to feed cereals anymore. And what I was finding was our whole rotation was driven by the need to find land that had fertility to grow the cereals, which meant I was ploughing out grass that's pretty expensive to establish, almost when it was at its peak, just so I could harvest the fertility to grow the cereals to feed the cattle to go back around again. And it didn't make any sense. And so we looked at the pasture for life, and it literally is as it says. They only ever eat pasture. Hay, silage, fine, but they don't eat any cereals. There's no premium for it at the minute. Whether there will be or whether there'll be assistance and subsidy and encouragement to do it, I don't know. But economically, it stacks up. What we know is that we've done our own trials, and I've been right at the forefront of this, and it's the taste test. Definitely the meat tastes better. It's a different type of fat, and it is a very digestible fat. I would, if given the choice, I'd eat pasture meat over cereal fed meat.
Good. We're asking if there's an inspection or certification system for it.
Yeah, it is, and it's actually much more rigorous than I thought. I hate inspections. I think everybody hates inspections. But what I really hate is an inspection that means nothing. And I hate an inspection that you think, hang on a minute, how come I'm being pulled up on this? Because I can see what's going on over there. Or the Pasture for Life one is pretty rigorous. And I actually, I do hate them. But I don't mind it when I know that it's rigorous for everybody.
Yes, when everybody's in an even playing field, it's fine. You can see, or you see the point in it. Andrea Walker was asking, what do you think was your biggest barrier to adopting the system, and did it prove as a big a deal as you suspected?
Probably me. I was the biggest barrier to it, actually. It's very, very difficult to throw away all of the principles that you've grown up with. It's not a natural instinct is to say that all of the knowledge that I've gained over the years is useless. I'm going to throw that away and start on something I have no idea about.
Okay, so it can be difficult. I think sometimes our biggest barriers and obstacles. Right, Craig, I think we'll maybe just move on to the last video about the cropping system now.
So this was a field that was in organic milling wheat last year after coming out of a ryegrass clover mix. And after harvest, we left the stubbles and then we grazed them with cattle over the sort of Christmas period to give that break for everybody from shifting cattle. And then we ploughed this again actually and planted the milling oats, trying oats this year because market for malting barley hasn't been great since COVID. But the milling oat route is certainly better for breakfast porridge and baby food. The organic market's actually much smaller than a conventional market, so it's starting to mature a bit more. People are starting to be looking at it from the merchant's perspective, but we've found it much easier to go to an end user and find out what they want us to grow. So that's how we've ended up growing these crops. This will come out after this harvest, and we'll graze the sheep in here probably, maybe put the cattle back in, and then it'll go into organic beans in the spring, and then probably into green manure and back to grass. This type of land up here, I think once we've had 3 cereal crops from it, we'll start to see weed burdens get worse and worse. Beans are quite an open crop anyway, so I'll be interested to see how we get on with that. But rather than try and get another crop afterwards, we'll probably just stick it back in grass. Yield-wise, I think the one thing I would say is that we're learning that variation is the key to organic farming. We've been growing heritage wheats. Some of those were bred in the 1800s. Our biggest disaster was 1.5 tons a hectare of milling wheat, but grown on some pretty poor land that hadn't had fertility built, and we were just a bit hungry to try and grow something for our own mill. But we've also easily achieved the 4.5-5 tons a hectare in spring wheat, and again, it's not going to set any records, but it has cost us very little. There's no royalties on the seed, home saved seed, and there's no input other than sowing it and combining it. So beans, we grew beans organically before, and they're very variable, all depending on the weather at flowering. But yeah, I would hope we can get 1.5 tons of beans an acre. But I think if realistically, we probably need to budget on 1.25 tons. In our cereals at the minute, all our establishment is with a plough. We've just gone on to a disc drill, Vardostat disc drill, and we're trialling undersowing all of our cereals with a white clover mix in their first year, which enables us to then theoretically direct sow into them afterwards. We're trialling it because I'm not sure we can get the control of volunteers correct for milling, but if it was just for feed, I don't think there'll be a problem with it. But our aim is to try and not have to plough again after we've ploughed out the grass, is don't touch it again with a plough. Not for the soil health benefits are well recorded, but actually cost. And we can graze stubble, but we can't graze it when it's ploughed. If we can leave it in stubble, we can. It's a lot more flexible for us, and we haven't ruined that drainage. Grazing cereals with sheep was traditionally that's how that was the earliest growth rate and fungicide around, and that was done as a matter of course. We actually started doing it when we were growing these tall strawed heritage varieties because they were weak strawed, and to try and stop them from going down, we started grazing them. And actually, I don't think it matters if you graze it or roll it, but grazing's certainly better. And if you're grazing, it's usually at a time when you're short of grass because you haven't got that spring growth yet. So it's worked really well for us. And some of it is just being brave and leaving them on. You always panic that you're going to graze out the growing point, but it's much later in the season than you think.
Well, that was our final video on the crops, but so we'll have a few questions on the crops, particularly on that, before we open it up to general discussion. And while we're waiting on questions to come in, I could maybe ask a question. You talked about green manure. What green manure are you using? And
cheap as possible. We're actually growing green manures now after the last conventional harvest, after the wheat, because last year when we tried to sow grass directly after wheat, it wasn't successful. We found out afterwards it was the residual herbicides that were knocking out all the very expensive herbs we were trying to plant. So I'm just going to give it a bit longer. And we literally just took all the sweepings off the floor basically and fired them in the drill. And it's a mixture of rye, wheat, barley, oats, and I bought a couple of bags of radish, fodder radish to chuck in with it. So it doesn't really matter as long as it's green and grows quickly. We're doing the white clover as a trial, undersowing that. And I like the idea that because we're growing spring crops, chances are the harvest will be much later, that the opportunity to put a green manure in afterwards is less. And this is a way of having the green cover already in place that we can make use of for sheep or grazing or whatever. And then if we don't manage to sow direct into it, well, we can either plow it, disc it, direct sow it, whatever we want to do with it, but it's green. So we're trying to get white clover is relatively cheap. We'll find out.
I've got a question about how do you weed your crops?
Well, the two fields that you've shown on the video, not my proudest moment, I will admit. We've got a 12-meter Einbach harrow, and we use that for weeding. But if you should roll back to May 2021, we'd had a prolonged period of dry weather, nothing had germinated, and then we had a pretty dismal May, and it sort of went through all its growth stages in about 3 weeks. And actually, we didn't weed it in the end. We didn't get a chance to. It went from 0 to 2 tall. We also didn't graze it. We didn't roll it. So that's why it's all leaning all over the place. And it was that May. The decision was made that we were going to make more mess if we did anything than if we didn't. What I found is that the tall crops or the tall strawed crops, the weed isn't really the issue because they smother them out. The oats are just their Conway that we grow because that was what was asked for. They're not particularly tall and they are weedy, but they've got clover underneath them to try and suppress that.
A combination of things. Have you tried any intercrops, for example, wheat and peas for combining?
Yeah, we did a trial with vetch and wheat to try and increase the protein in the wheat. And I think we'd been better off with a forager than a combine. I like the idea of it, but the reality is in the milling cereals, there's a very narrow window to catch the quality, and it doesn't really matter what the other crop is. You've got your main crop to be concerned with. But I know plenty of other people who are doing it for feed crops, and some of them are actually separating the crops out with seed dressers afterwards. I'm just not brave enough for it, and so my version of an intercrop is one that I don't have to worry about. I can leave it at the bottom and graze it.
Right. Turning back to some of the earlier videos for a minute. They're going back to you mentioned using garlic oil for the flies. Do you have any issues with ticks? And if so, do you find oil effective?
No tick problems. I don't know. I think there'll be people out there who are trying all sorts of other things. We use a mixture of citronella, garlic oil. I think there's about 4 or 5 things that come in a brown bag from Amazon that I buy, and I think our entire fly treatment for a year costs us about 30 quid. But it does smell horrendous. So I think any insect would be pretty put off by it.
Going back to the cropping side again, you mentioned grazing with the sheep. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Or because I think you've been doing it for quite a few years, you would have quite a bit of experience with the grazing of the sheep.
Yeah, I used to. When I grew up in Cornwall, and it was very common there to actually graze winter barley with sheep because it was far too lush come the spring anyway. So it was quite normal that was your T0 and your T1 in the day. If it's got no leaf, it can't have a disease. And that was what I grew up with. So putting sheep on cereals really straightforward. As I said, I think in the video, the brinkmanship is when you take them off. Putting them on is easy. Taking them off is always a decision that you spend a long time walking a field. But what I've noticed is that the sheep don't eat the most mature leaf. They eat the least mature leaf. So they're not really interested in the growing point until much later than you think. And if you take them off too soon, you don't get the benefit of it. And realistically, I would wait until they're sort of growth stage 32, almost 32 and a bit before you take the sheep off.
I think you'd have to be quite brave for that.
And I think if you were to mob graze them, which is the theory, we should put them in at high density. When you started the field, you get it right, and by the time you finished, you'd be wrong anyway. So that's why we bung them in and try it.
Right, going back to the livestock again. Do you worm your livestock?
Yeah, I still can't work out worms. We wormed our young stock before they went back out to grass. So they were left in the shed for a week, 10 days after we wormed them, turned them out. We moved them every single day. We did another worm count on them. They'd only ever been on clean ground, which had either been silaged the year before or grazed by sheep. They'd moved every day. They'd never been left in the field for more than 24 hours. And by the middle of August, we had worm counts that meant we had to worm them. I don't understand why. I don't understand where it comes from. I think there's either we've got a resistance issue or how are we getting them? The good thing is we can still do it, but we have to be able to prove a reason to do it. And so we work closely with the vets where they help identify the type of worm and the type of wormer that they would recommend. We bring them in to worm them, and we will turn them out onto a sort of a sacrifice paddock or something for a few days before we put them back out to the field again, so that they shed the worms before they go back out.
You talked about after 3 years that you were you were worried about weeds. What about fertility after 3 years? Do you find that starting to wane as well, or is it the weeds that you think are more of a problem for you?
We haven't been doing it for long enough, really, for me to know. I think a lot of it depends on what you put back on it in the meantime. So if we're going to put dung on, or we're going to graze it with livestock or whatever, I think the nitrogen is probably the least of our worries. I think the phosphates and the potash are the highest priority, because we can always put nitrogen back on with clover or with legumes, but we can't really address the other two. I think that the theory is you should only grow 2 straw crops organically, but I'd like to push that out because grass is so expensive to sow. That's why I really want the legume in there as well.
We're going back to the worms again. They're just a comment more than anything, a question. Are the worms not brought in by deer and badgers?
They're brought in by badgers, Ian. Badgers do all the damage.
Right. Anybody kind of open up to any general questions or any discuss points that folk want to make? I've got a question here. Is there anything else you should have measured before you started? Hindsight's always a good thing, kind of looking back, is there something that you think you should have measured before you started?
There probably is, and I haven't actually worked out what it is yet, but I know last year I realized that we were using SOYL for soil analysis. And I realized that the analysis of the field was telling me one thing, but the plant was telling me something different. And we're growing milling wheats, which were telling me that we were short of phosphate, but our analysis was telling us that we had plenty of phosphate. So I dug into it a bit more and found out that actually there are an awful lot of other things that affect the uptake of phosphates. And we are now starting, in fact, later this month, we're starting an Albright test, which is it's a sort of, although it's a soil analysis, it actually balances and shows you what is affecting each of the elements individually. And I think I'm going to find out that I wish I tested that before
you started, and then you would know what was.
I would have known what to do when I saw a crop that was suffering from something, but all the information I had in front of me told me it should be fine.
Interesting. Right, well, I don't, if that, oops. Would you have any top tips for someone keen on giving mob grazing a go for the first time?
Don't spend much money. Don't overthink it. The first thing I would do is divide a field in half with one strand of electric wire. Graze one side of it and then graze the other side of it. It's not the grazing that gives you the benefit, it's the rest period. And you don't realize how much grass recovers until you let it rest. And I know it's the same thing as taking them off a field and shutting them in another one, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be long before you bought a second fence wire and you divided it the other way, and then you got 4 paddocks. Think about the water. We started off early on trying to put in semi-permanent troughs in fields to try and make the daily move quicker and easier. It was just a faff and it didn't work, and they just poached around them and it was a mess. We just used black pipe that we pull over the ground and just move a trough every day. But we realized that actually you don't need to spend a lot of money to try it, and started at a time of year when you've got plenty of grass, because you can't really go wrong. You know, you've done it before. There's nothing to lose.
Right, this is related, but maybe expanding a wee bit more on how does your rotation work, and how long are your rest periods? Do you graze harder in the non-growing season?
This is just the grassland rotation. Yeah, there are lots of different theories on this. We found that there are some people who would say that you come around quite quickly, so you're always grazing green leaf. And there are other people who are happy to come around and graze tall grass, and we're happy on the tall grass front. What I've seen when you graze it too quickly and come around too quickly is a lot of bare ground, and that's the bit that I don't like. I like the tall grass grazing because all those seed heads are trodden back in again. We are probably looking at somewhere between 60 and 90 days between cattle reaching the same paddock again, but we have been down to 30 and 40 just because of because of a block of ground. I don't really think, there are people who are very religious about it, and I'm not particularly religious about it. I think, try it and see. Certainly a 60-day period in June is very different from a 60-day period in December. And in the non-growing part of the season, I would probably go much longer. I'm happy to only graze it once between November and probably March, April.
How do you manage your water supply during frost?
Learn a lot of swear words. What we've actually started doing, I didn't want to spend any money on the system because I didn't know if we would still be doing it in 5 years' time. So I tried to do everything above ground with pipes that we could then, we just towed the same pipes everywhere. But actually, we also faced an antiquated watering system that was 20mm pipes and insufficient supply for big groups of cattle. And so what we've done is we've actually reinstalled water pipe work around the farm. We built ourselves or converted an old McConnell shakerator into a mole plough for burying pipes. So there is no disturbance really. It's very quick. We can do about 1,000 meters a day with 2 guys. And every 200 meters, we put a little pop-up, and the pop-up has got a quick connector on it. And so as long as cattle can always go back to a trough, and if the ground is frozen, my theory is it doesn't matter if they run back over fields they've grazed before, because the ground's frozen, they're not going to do any damage. But the real key is get them back to somewhere where we can get water. And so by putting in these below ground networks and the pop-ups, we can always be within a couple of meters of water.
Good. And then we're going back to more how it affected the whole business. I think you dealt a wee bit in the introduction with this, but maybe you could expand on how it's affected your bottom line, excluding conversion money, because you've obviously seen big changes from when you were conventional to yields and stuff and output from your cattle and stuff.
Yeah, crystal ball. I mean, we are making more money now than we were when we were conventional. We were conventional up, the whole place was conventional in 2015. We always made money, but we never made a lot. We spent far too much. And when I sat down and did a kind of fag packet calculation a few years ago based on losing half of our BPS, and I thought that the environmental and the vegan movement would knock 20% off the value of red meat. It was clear we needed to save 200,000 out of our business to try and even stand still. And I just couldn't see that coming from anything that wasn't fairly major. I sort of feel a little bit guilty because I was trying to do budgets 5 years ahead, and I was looking at them thinking these budgets are wrong because they're telling me we're going to make more money, and I cannot believe that that's the case. Conversely with that, I sold some of our last conventional wheat yesterday for a price I've never seen before in my life, and I think, you know, by harvest 2022, I might be regretting not having some conventional cereals to sell. But I also sold some fertilizer we didn't need, and I was delighted to sell that as well because that was worth. So I really don't know, it's the honest answer, where it's going to head. What I do know is our business is more resilient because we're not buying things. Well, I think anybody who's involved in agriculture knows that your margin remains about the same every year, but your risk goes up if your input costs go up. And that risk is sometimes actually just not worth taking the grief. I think if I was sitting with 1,000 tons of nitrogen fertilizer in the shed that I bought last year, I'd seriously think of selling it and not growing the crop.
Interesting. I think the kind of fertilizer prices are a lot of conventional folk will be seriously thinking about the fertilizer and the nutrient planning and kind of looking at their systems. I think because the prices that are the fertilizers at the moment, and folk need to realise as well the value of markets. I don't think folk have really they've still got an idea on their head from years ago what muck's maybe worth, but it's actually worth an awful lot more compared to what it was.
Well, certainly with growing grass, if you're just grazing grass, you don't need fertilizer. You really don't. And we were spending, before we went organic, we were spending 70,000 a year on grass and fertilizer for silage and grazing. And it doesn't take long to knock that out of the bottom line. Yeah, we need more acres to do it. Don't get me wrong. We were spending a lot of money on minerals every year. Last year we bought minerals. We spent 17,000 on them. We just stopped it overnight, and it's amazing how many things that when you're spending a lot of money on growing a crop, you can't afford to not do the next thing. So I think that's why fungicides creep up every year. You spent 150 quid a hectare on your fungicides. That last one for 7 quid, you can't afford not to put it on. You have to do it. And it's quite refreshing to just get off it and stop. We just don't need it.
Good. I don't know if folk can still hear me all right. My earpiece has stopped working, so I'm having to use the computer.
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah, we can hear you.
All right.
Yeah.
That's fine. I was just going to say to everybody, thanks for coming along tonight. It's been really interesting. Thanks to Sam for being so open, and we'll probably will stick around after we've finished this evening for a few minutes just to see if anybody's got any final questions they want to ask. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Craig, for doing all the gadget work, the technical stuff. And thank you again to Sam for coming along. But we'll stay on the call. Just if anybody wants to come in with any questions that haven't been answered yet, or any last minute questions you're thinking of. Okay, thank you.